All right, next up, let's talk about your knees and your thighs in relation to your hips. And so this is gonna be everything from your quadriceps to your hamstrings, all the way up to your hip flexors and your glutes. So we're looking at really this extension and flexion. And now that's a lot of muscle. The biggest muscle in your body is your glute, and your hips also have a rotation element, which we'll get into next when it comes into how the hips play with the spine. But let's talk about how your hips and your thighs work with extension and everything that goes from running and squatting and deadlifting and all that fun stuff. So your knee is like the awkward middle child. Your knee is the bottom of your femur, which looks like that, and the top of your tibia that looks like that. That's your knee. If you've ever seen a diagram, it's not pretty. Of course, you got your little patella that sits on front, but all the knee does is flex and extend. So you got flexion, extension. That's it. Now, it does have a little bit of rotation components, so your knees can rotate in and out. That's a healthy thing to have, but it's not nearly as strong, it's not nearly as prevalent as what you're doing in the flexion extension. Now, there are a few big muscles that play into this, and we're gonna talk about how the feet and ankles play into this in a second, but what you wanna think about is you got your quadriceps, you've got your hamstrings, you've got your adductors and your abductors, okay? Those are four big things because they wrap around the knee at multiple levels all the way around. You have four quadricep muscles, your vastus medialis, vastus lateralis, vastus intermedialis, and rectus femoris. The rectus femoris also attaches up at the hip, which means it can do this motion. The other 3-4 muscles just do this motion. Your hamstring, you've got your semimembranosus, your semitendinosus that attach on one side, and you get your biceps femoris that attach on the other side. So there's three muscles that work attaching up at the hip and attaching down below the knee. All they do is flex the knee, okay? Then we want to look up at the hip. You've got your hip flexors, which are your iliopsoas, the primary muscles there, and your rectus femoris, which again is part of the quadriceps. Those muscles, what they do is they bring the knee up and they flex the hip. Now your iliopsoas is actually two muscles, your iliacus and your psoas major, that come and they wrap around and they attach on the femur. Their primary job is flexion at the hip. You named it. Now the opposite side of that is your glute. Now there's three main glute muscles, glute max, glute med, glute min, and they do primarily rotation and extension at the hip. But the biggest thing I want you to think about is your glutes are primary hip extensors. This is their job. They extend the hip. Hip flexors flex, hip extensors, your glutes extend. Your knee extensors, your quads, extend the knee, and your knee flexors, your hamstrings, flex the knee. That's what they should do. Now, people run into problems when their hip flexors are weak and they use their knee extensors to flex the knee, to flex the hip. So where people run into problems is when they're not using the primary muscle group to move in that primary range of motion, meaning that my quadriceps, their primary job is extending the knee, their secondary job is flexing the hip. And if my hip flexors are very weak and I can't do this, that's when I'm going to use my quadriceps, and that's when my knees are going to start to ache. Same thing with the hamstrings. If my glutes are not working well to extend the hips, I'm going to use my hamstrings. This is the #1 reason people strain a hamstring when they're running, is that they're trying to use the hamstring to extend the hip and flex the knee at the same time, and it does not work very well. Now, the whole point of that is just to say that there are muscles that work, but if you don't use them in the right pattern, they're not going to work in the correct way. You will lose performance and risk injury. So within that, the answer is to pick better exercises to improve that. And we'll talk about that in the training portion, but you really want to think about making sure that you are using your glutes when you want to use those and your hamstrings when you want to use those. Okay, it's a big distinction to be made there. Now, let's talk about how to check your knee and what it should look like. So you want to have full flexion. You want to be able to pull this knee up all the way behind. Another way to do that is thinking, I want to be able to sit down and lock back. So I have full flexion at the knee. And the other side is I want to have some extension at the knee. So I want to be able to drive the knee down and have some hyperextension at the knee. So you see my heels come off. Now, if you are a little bit asymmetrical with that, or you have surgery and you don't have the ability to drive the knee down, that's going to be a part that you're missing, and that will come back with time. So that's going to be a big portion to think about. Second, you want to think about extension, okay? So I want to be able to extend the hip and lean forward. And so if I can't at least pull this back and get to a 180-degree bend here, I'm missing extension there. And then secondarily, I want to be able to flex the hip. So thinking about sitting all the way down, at the very least, getting your hips down underneath the knee, okay? So those are a brief thing, and what you want to think about is that your knees are extend or flex, your hips extend and flex. In this instance, is the basic thing you want to understand there. The big muscles there, working correctly, are going to set you up for a great level of performance, health, and overall strength.